Thank you, Sam. I'm grateful to be here with you, this teaching seminar. I was invited to come talk about this book, and I assume that most of you have got it. I've seen a copy here. So I think I'm supposed to talk about a little bit about the history, but mostly about the content of the book, and just visit with you. If you have any questions, please ask them as we go along. I haven't prepared a talk or anything like that. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what I've been doing, and then we'll go through some things in the book, sort of let you know how it was organized, how it's organized, and sort of what's coming as well. So I'm really grateful to have Susan here with me. I wasn't sure she was going to be here. She just came from the temple. So thank you, Susan, for being here. How many of you, as I came in the room, I thought, most of you have probably been hired since I was at the university. That's what a few years ago, Kevin said to me, John, most of the people have forgotten you by now. So I am grateful to be with you. But were any of you here when I was an academic vice president? Okay, so some of you know who I am anyway. I'm glad to see you here. And if I don't know your names, just volunteer and talk. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about this book and how it came about, and then talk about the contents, and then talk about sort of future volumes that are coming up. So anyway, first of all, what happened is when I was released from BYU, I think I've retired 3 times from the university. So one time when I was called to BYU Hawaii, then when I came from BYU Hawaii, President Holland said, John, at 70 years old, that's kind of a magic number in the church. Just expect to be released. So I thought I was going to be forcibly retired again. All I've wanted to do in my life is teach, and teach my subject, and it's been hard. Then I came back to BYU, and Kevin and Shane said, we want you to do something. Don't retire, because we want you to do something here at the university. So I said, well, I'll do that if you'll let me teach at least one class and not charge an FTE against my department. I know how that goes. I don't want that. You've got to come up with the FTE somehow. So for a while, I got to teach a little Shakespeare. That was fun. And then I got to teach the Book of Mormon with Susan. We did a kind of last lectures in the Book of Mormon series. Was it in this room, Sue? Well, it was in this room. So we're back to where we were teaching. So that's a lot of fun. Anyway, so they said, we want you to do something for us. And, I'm kind of a mission person, and Kevin knows that, and Shane's kind of come to realize that as well. So they said, we want you to revise this book. Have any of you seen this book before? Do you know this? So this is a book by Jack Welch and Don Norton, and it collects talks about BYU. And it's called Envisioning Zion, but it's really more about this university than just. It doesn't have a lot to say about BYU Hawaii, but or BYU Idaho, or Ensign College, but it does have a lot to say about this university, and so it's become a real partner. My copy is pretty worn because I've read it a lot, read in it a lot. So they said, would you revise this? Do you know why they wanted me to think, why they were thinking of doing this? Anybody know what's coming up at BYU? What is coming up here? It's pretty soon. The sesquicentennial is coming up, isn't it? So they said, in connection with the sesquicentennial, the 150 years after BYU was organized, would you like to do this? It's about 25 years out of date now, and it needs to be revised. So that was my initial reaction or invitation from Kevin and Shane. And so I set about thinking, okay, I'm a mission person. I'd be happy to do that. That kind of fits where I am in my life too. So anyway, so as I started into this project of revising this book, the way it's organized is purely chronological. It's organized chronologically. It's got no introductions to it. It's just got the text of the talks. And the talks are organized, well, they're also organized by person. So, you know, if you have Boyd Packer, you may have 3 talks by Boyd Packer, but otherwise they're chronologically organized. So I decided, well, one thing I want to do is make this very user-friendly. So I'm going to write some introductions. And so this new book, as you'll see, has little introductions that sort of tell you what you're going to read about in the book. Because I thought, you know, nowadays people just thumb through things. They want to know what's in them before they read them anyway. So I've written little introductions to every talk that is in the book. The other thing I did that they wanted me to do is, well, the other thing I did is I decided this is going to be a little fat, and nobody wants to read a fat book. And so as I talked to the editors of this, they said, well, why don't you, let's think about dividing it into more than one volume. And I really fought against that, because I thought, you're not going to want to read a fat book. So I cut the talks, and finally they said, just make it more than one volume. So we are making it into 3 volumes so that they fit in your hand really, really well. You can, they're kind of attractive to pick up, and I like books that aren't too long. So the books have introductions, and it's not going to be more than one volume. I'm going to tell you about what's happened to the volumes 2 and 3, and I think that's all. I think that'll be all that I'm going to do anyway. So, and then I said, let's organize it thematically, not just chronologically. So you can see this volume, the first volume, begins with foundations, and then there's a section called Dreams on the title page. But if you look a little later, it's Dreams, Prophecies, and Prayers. So there's actually, BYU has kind of got a rich history of people dreaming about it or prophesying about it, or I wanted prayers, especially the prayers. For me, I wanted. You'll see. I was going to ask you about this, but one of the themes that comes, I hope you'll pick up in the book, is that there's a connection between universities and temples that go way back in our history, all the way to having schools in Kirtland in the temple, and when I read Doctrine and Covenants, it's hard for me to tell sometimes when it says organize a house, even a house of learning, a house of faith, and so forth, if they're talking about schools or the school of the prophets or temples, because those things are linked really closely together in our church doctrine, history, and in our theology. So I wanted that to be a theme of the book, and I wanted to include some prayers about temple dedication prayers. I was actually just off my mission when this temple was dedicated here, and I remember I was called into a bishopric as a secretary of some sort anyway. So I was in the basement when President Smith gave this prayer, and he dedicated not just the building, but he dedicated church schools, and particularly the school next door. And so BYU has a prayer of dedication. We're included in the prayer of dedication of the temple. And when President Oaks dedicated, when President Oaks came down to dedicate the second temple in Provo, he once again mentioned the universities in the prayer of dedication. So I hope that you will feel, as you read the book, a connection between temples of learning here and the temple itself. Anyway, so that's sort of a theme in the first book, is temples. Anyway, so that's the first part of the book. I thought we'd look at the foundation section and then look at a little bit of dreams in this first little bit. Any questions so far? That's how this came about. I was asked to do this by the president, by Shane, and at the time we thought it was going to be one thick, bigger volume, but they all agreed. They also agreed that a shorter volume, and also one that can be accessed online. The other thing that just quickly that happened is I said, I don't want just something that sits on shelves. I've done a lot of writing in my university career, and I'd like something that people actually have and use. And so they said, we're going to give one of these books to everybody at the university, all the employees and all the faculty and staff and full-time employees. This is going to be a present for everybody. Why do you think they wanted a book like this, and why do you think they wanted to give something like this out to the whole university? Anyone? This is a pretty big expense, actually.
I assume it's to educate us and let us know what we're about.
Yeah, I'm sure that's it. To educate us, let us know what we're about. Anyone else want to comment on this? Yeah.
There's something about having a common vision. It's not just that we know what it's about, but that we collectively
Yeah.
kind of similar in our focus.
Where did you do your graduate study, by the way?
Minnesota.
Did they talk about spiritual things in your graduate program much?
No.
No. Okay. No, I was at Berkeley. They didn't talk about that too much, did they? Okay. Yeah. There's a real sense that the university, coming into its sesquicentennial especially, has an opportunity to reaffirm its mission. And I don't know of a president of the university who's been more focused on the mission statement than Kevin Worthen. It's been surprising to me how often he refers back to that mission statement. He's a real mission-oriented guy. And yet, I remember, I won't say who now because I don't want to indicate the college, but I remember talking to one of the vice presidents about one of the colleges in the university, and he said, when I was on the sesquicentennial committee, he said, we never talked about mission with new faculty. I think what we've done is we've kind of given that over, and I can see why it's difficult, given that over to church clearance, as if, okay, if they've got general authority clearance, then they're okay. We don't need to, when we hire faculty, we hire them both as for the discipline, but also for their discipleship. And we don't want to just fob that off into the discipleship part to the church to worry about. I think we need to worry about that too. I certainly felt that way at BYU Hawaii. At BYU Hawaii, I'd interview every faculty member that we hired. Now that's really hard to do at a university of this size. But at Harvard, the university president there was very involved in the tenuring process, and they had to get through the president as well as their department. And anyway, it isn't a foreign role for a president to get involved in that, nor should it be for departments. So with the department chair, what I would do is with my academic vice president, I would call in, interview each faculty member that was being interviewed for candidacy, and I would ask them questions about mission fit. So here's President McKay's vision of the university. How would you teach math with the Spirit? What does that mean to you? And let the candidates talk about what that meant, how they would do that. Because again, these are not questions they're getting asked in graduate school. You're going to be hired as an 18th century novelist in the English department. And when I would hire people in the English department, I'd do the same thing. I'd say, you think that we're hiring you is primarily for your expertise because we've advertised for a Miltonist, or we've advertised for a Shakespearean, or we've advertised for a composition person. But you know what? More important than the specific skills, that's really important. But more important than that is that you teach people to think and write. And also more important is that you yourselves are a model of what it means to be a disciplined, a disciple in the disciplines, someone who has really immersed themselves and loves the disciplines, but also loves the Lord. And so that's what your students are going to, when they leave here, this isn't a Ponzi scheme where I'm just trying to give people who will just follow me, and there's this whole realm of a bunch of people that I teach, and maybe one in the several thousand will be a Shakespearean scholar. But you're teaching people who will need to learn to think and to read, to write, and of course in the church sense, that you want them to be faithful in the church. I once had a faculty member when I was department chair whose students were leaving the church. And the faculty member said, that's not my responsibility. They have their agency. And I said, that's true, but it ought to worry you a lot. You ought to stay up nights thinking and praying about this, even if they do have their agency, that if they're saying your class was my exit ticket out of the church, that ought to worry you a lot. You ought to be concerned about that. Anyway, so let's talk about this foundations then. Let's talk about, Susan said, don't talk so much about the origin of the book and the general. Talk about the specifics. So I'm going to try to follow her directions, and let's just look at a little bit of this. Can I just read one little passage though from the introduction? This was from a talk that I gave when I was an academic vice president, and I still think this is true. I said Brigham Young University is built of brick and mortar. It comprises libraries and laboratories, classrooms and cafeterias, well-groomed grounds and cluttered faculty offices. It's built of impressive financial resources and of remarkable human capital. But above all, BYU is and ever has been built of dreams and ideals. Our house of learning is also a house of dreams. So this university, I think more than most universities, is built of mission, of who we are. It's not just another job. Sometimes you have students who come because our law school was highly ranked, and it's fairly inexpensive. That's not the right reason to come to BYU, nor just that it gave you a job and you couldn't get a job anywhere else. You really do need to come with a commitment to who we are at a fundamental level and advancing that mission. So where does this mission begin then? Where would you have started a book like this? Where do they start this book? Wouldn't you start, I've always thought you'd start with the prime directive. I used to call it that after my Star Wars kind of, when Brigham Young charged Carl G. Mazur, he went up there and said, so what do you want me to do? And Brigham Young was quite succinct and terse in what he said. Teach everything, even the alphabet and the multiplication tables with the Spirit of God. That's all on your way. That's an important foundation statement for the university. But I thought I wanted to begin before that. I wanted to begin even before Brigham Young, though he's our namesake in this university. I wanted to begin with Joseph Smith and with Scripture and Revelation. So Susan, you can blame Susan for this, but she said they called you to do this because you've written a lot about this stuff, so don't be afraid of putting yourself in the book. So I began with a little preface, a little talk I gave to graduate students once about the scriptural injunctions to learning, but it really begins with Scripture. And my preface talks about even in the New Testament. Did you know that Christ added, when he went to Deuteronomy and said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, might, Christ himself adds to Deuteronomy mind and strength. And I wanted to make sure that we included some of these fundamental scriptures, so that's what I talk about in my preface. But where the book begins, it talks about, it says the first section is called the Basic Constitution of Church Education. Anyone from reading it, does anyone know what that basic constitution was, or where this phrase comes from? I'm not sure if you remember my introduction, but it comes from Dallin Oaks. When he was his first talk to the university called the House of Faith, it was just after President Kimball's second century address, and he said, our basic constitution of all church education is D&C 88, which is also called the olive leaf. So I began with the olive leaf. I began with D&C 88, and that's the School of the Prophets. Anyway, do you know what some of the scriptures that are in D&C 88 that are often used in connection with the university might be? that are in that? Anyone remember? Yes, you're shaking your head, yeah?
Study history.
What?
Study history.
Study history. Well, that's in 90, I think, or 93. But it does say, yeah, but you've got politics in there too. Good. I like that too. Yeah. The glory of God is intelligence. Yeah. There's a that's also in, I included those in 90 and 93. But yeah, by studying and by faith, a house of learning, but also those other scriptures. So those scriptures are actually really important. To me, they've been fundamental in my own constitution. And when I was this is different. This isn't in the book, but when I was a student here, there was a really odd honors program, and I was an honors aide, and it was where you invent your own general education, and then you justify it, and people would usually choose to do the things that the rest of the university had to do. But it made me think a lot, because I read hundreds of student justifications of what they're studying and why. So they'd write, well, I think I need to learn about whatever. So I thought since I was an undergraduate a lot about why do we have whatever we have? Why do we require what we require at universities? Why do we do that? And some of those things are in the Doctrine and Covenants. The glory of God is intelligence is in the Doctrine and Covenants, but also studying kingdoms and studying about government is in there, but learning languages, tongues, and peoples. In my preface, I argue that in addition to the first commandment to learn about God was often used to justify in the Middle Ages to study physics, because you're looking at his handiwork. But what about to love our neighbor? I thought, for me, how can you love your neighbor if you don't understand him or her? That there's a really wonderful reason for people in the social sciences, humanities, and others to learn about other people and what makes them tick. That seems to me part of the second great commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. Then you've got to try to understand your neighbor. Anyway, so there's a lot of scriptural justifications for learning in this first section of the doctrine of the book, and President Oakes called this section the great basic constitution. Notice he's using the lawyer's terms, but the basic constitution of all church education is this. Could I, before we leave section 88, Susan?
Well, I was just going to say that with the recent kind of trend in teaching, that teaching and learning are one and the same, or
Yeah.
And I think that comes out too in the Doctrine and Covenants, that we appoint one to be the teacher, but we're all edified of all.
Yeah, I love that. In fact, when I was academic vice president, for some reason that phrase just kept haunting me. And I kept thinking, we need to find ways to make sure that all are teaching of all. I was a little hesitant to impose a single teaching methodology on the university. I thought, that doesn't work very well. People need to find their own medium. And yet, I thought it was really important for people. There's a German saying that lernen durch lernen, that we learn by teaching, and lernen durch lehren. Isn't that right? I think that's the right German. We learn through teaching, and certainly I felt that. Yeah, go ahead. Pardon? Say that again. Yes. 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 I love that. Thank you for sharing. And there's the idea of grace and teaching is really important. There's another thing that really has touched me for many years about this when, when it talks about the school of the prophets. At the very end of this section, it says, and when he cometh to the house of the Lord, for he should be first in the house. That's the president of the church. And behold, this is beautiful, that he may be example. And let him offer himself in prayer upon his knees before God in token of remembrance of the everlasting covenant. I remember when President Kimball once said, he said, I hope that you've been on your knees this morning praying for your students as they're getting ready for school, that you're also praying for them. And anyway, I'm always touched by that when the president of the church said that when people came into the school of the prophets, they were to be greeted with these words. We don't have many set prayers in the church, but this was the prayer that was to be offered by the teacher, who was the president of the church. When you'd come into the school, he'd raise up his hands and he'd say, Art thou a brother or a sister, a brother or brethren? I salute you in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. The prophet of the church salutes the students in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, in token or remembrance of the everlasting covenant in which I covenant to receive you in fellowship. In a determination that is fixed and immovable and unchangeable, to be your friend, your brother, through the grace of God in the bonds of love, to walk in all the commandments of God blameless, in thanksgiving forever. Amen. Can you imagine that that's what the prophet, how he greeted each person? And it seems to me there's a model there in the way we should think about our students as brothers or brethren in Christ. At some point, these distinctions that we have are going to fall off and fade. President Neil Maxwell talks about this in one of the talks that I've included in the volume. He says, at some point, the distinction of professor or doctor or whatever, Herr Doktor, Professor, whatever, however they greet you, that's going to fade and we're going to be brothers and sisters again. I think of that with our children, our grandchildren, that you're responsible for them, but at some point they're your same age, according to the gospel. We're in the same family. And anyway, I love that even the prophet of the church said, I greet you as a brother or sister in the covenant of Christ, with a covenant that we will walk humbly in honor. And so anyway, the book starts then with Joseph Smith and the school of the prophets. Joseph Smith also created a university. In another talk, I talked about this. That in some ways, BYU is the extension, it's the extension of the University of Nauvoo. And at the University of Nauvoo, the curriculum was broad because of D&C 88. It included languages and included a lot of stuff in it that you wouldn't think of as just religious because of 88. Anyway, so that's where the book starts. It starts before the charge to Brigham Young, and then in the charge to Brigham Young that Brigham Young gave to Carl G. Mazur is also, again, really important. I didn't want to neglect that, so that's where the book goes next in our foundations. Any questions so far or comments? Yeah, Susan.
Well, you should read the final quote on page 14. You alluded to it, but
Okay.
Carl G. Mazur didn't feel like he was given much of a charge. He was kind of disappointed.
He really was.
But that charge has been a theme over and over, and every single talk quotes it, and we try to live by it.
It's been, I call it the prime directive. It's kind of like Star Wars. This is what you're supposed to do no matter who you are or where you are in the universe. And Carl G. Mazur, when he got that charge, do you want to read that, Susan? He felt like he'd he'd asked for something important and been given this stone, this.
But what did the words of the prophet mean? Brother Mazur at first felt that he had received but a stone where he had asked for bread. But as time rolled on, he realized do nothing without the Spirit of God. Oh, how in the years that followed, this holy admonition became the very guiding star of his life.
Thank you very much. So that's where we begin, and we should never forget our origin. So I have that little story by his son, and then I have a little story where Carl G. Mazer himself tells about, in his own words, about receiving this charge. Again, some of this is in Educating Zion, and I wanted to keep as much as I could from that. And then, anyone else? Yes?
Well, I just wanted to say, I think it's interesting that Carl Mazer felt like he didn't have much of a charge there, because these days we're being told, gospel methodology. We're having a panel this afternoon to try and figure out what that means.
What does it mean? It's a good question. Do you know where that phrase comes from?
Ultimately, I'm not sure.
Okay, read my book. So one of the most important talks, at least, when I was on this little panel that we were looking at the sesquicentennial, I said to the people, I'm not really much on monuments. I don't know what monument you want. I know we put the bells in on the centennial, and it worried me that we'd kind of forgotten what President Kimball said about those bells. He said that the morality of the bells would signal the morality of the students. You let your heart kind of remember how good you're supposed to be when you hear those bells. Come, come, ye saints. And there's a beautiful quote that's from the 2nd century address, but it comes from the 2nd century address. It's a really very important address, and it's the one address that, again, I think everybody should read as we are approaching our 2nd century, the second half of the 2nd century now. It's really a very important address, and so I put it in this book, and that's after J. Reuben Clark's little talk, which is the one that follows Carl G. Mazer, then J. Reuben Clark, then President Kimball in the 2nd century address. J. Reuben Clark's talk is also important. When President Packer was here, he once told me personally, but he also says this in something that you're supposed to read this, or it's available this week in Snow White Doves. He said you should read that every year. For him, he says it was like scripture. So, and I think it's a powerful address. It's really more aimed at institute and seminary, but it's also aimed at all church educators, he said. So that's the next talk, and then the 2nd century address, President Kimball's talk. Nobody would have been here for that. No, but President Worthen said that it made a huge difference for him. He didn't hear it, but he read it. And it's one of the reasons he came to BYU, is he felt kind of drawn here by this remarkable vision. And it really is a remarkable talk by a sitting president of the church to come down and talk about the university's mission. That doesn't happen very often, where you have a living president of the church come and talk specifically, not just a general talk about the gospel, but a specific talk about BYU's mission. And he refers back to a talk that he gave some years before President Kimball gave, called Education for Eternity. Anyway, if you're just going to read one talk in this section, I would encourage you to read the talk by President Kimball called The 2nd Century of Brigham Young University. That's where we have the metaphor of becoming an educational Mount Everest, and also that we have the things washed up to our feet by the past, and we need to be able to, we need to teach what we've learned from the past. It's tremendous. He also talks about being unique. I think that's a real challenge, but anyway. So, yeah, Susan?
Just don't call on me if you don't want me.
No, I want you. She told me I need to talk more about what's in the talks, not just the, so.
When you talked about the carillon and the music, I just think let's get the actual quote.
Let's look at the words.
59.
Yeah.
It's just so beautiful at the bottom of 59 again.
Do you want to read those? Stand up and read them so the whole class can hear you. I love team teaching with Susan.
But anyway, just as these bells played to thy glory. Let the morality of the graduates of this university provide the music of hope for the inhabitants of this planet. That's so beautiful. We ask that all those everywhere who open their ears to hear the sounds of good music will also be more inclined to open their ears to hear the good tidings brought to us by thy Son. And now, dear Father, let these bells ring sweet music unto thee. Let the everlasting hills take up the sound. Let the mountains shout for joy and the valleys cry loud. And let the seas and dry lands tell their wonders of the eternal King. I mean, that's our heritage.
I love that. Don't you love that? It's not a wonderful. When you hear the bells, think of that. Let the bells lift the hearts of the hearers when they hear them, and let the morality of the graduates of this university provide the music of hope. I love that phrase, the music of hope for this world. Again, I kind of wish that was stated at almost all of our commencements as you go out. Yes, go ahead.
John, this might be a little bit of blasphemy to you, but awesome book. But BYU has the podcast of Envisioning Zion,
Yeah.
where they release each of the.
Yeah.
They just did Packers this week, and that's been really helpful. Actually, hear President Kimball's voice
Yeah.
as he gives that talk, and many others. So that's a really helpful resource as well.
Thank you very much. So again, we wanted this not just to sit on people's bookshelves, but to be absorbed by the university. And one of the ways was podcasts. I'm not into that as much. In fact, they had me redo one of my talks. They didn't capture always the talks that I gave and so they had me reread one of my talks. And but I do like that. Again, the idea is to get this out, and I love hearing President Kimball's raspy voice again. It just brings that back to my mind. Of course, I'm a lot older than most of you that way. But yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Tanner, for your contribution, your consecrated sacrifice. I've been really struck by this kind of symphony between you and Susan and her contribution. And I'm wondering, will we see more women in the future volumes?
So
And why is that important?
that's a really good question. There are no women in this volume. And that was a big issue for me. And I've tried to let me talk about that right now, because let me go beyond to the dream section, because I was able to find a woman's speech in there that I think everybody should know. And I'd only heard of it quoted as in the third person. So I went to the university archives and found Zina's speech. And somebody wrote at the top, I think this was a speech that she gave. It wasn't just a recollection. She was a student of Carl G. Mazur's and a daughter of Brigham Young. Let me tell you the story, and then let's read a little bit of that. And then in volumes 2 and 3, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about even more women that I've included. I'd like to find more, but I am limiting this to university leaders, and so I've had to put deans and vice presidents. Got Marilyn Arnold and I'll tell you about who's in some of the other volumes. But let's look at Zina. Can you turn to Zina's? This is one, again, I wish every student that comes to the university, every faculty member that comes to the university knew this great experience of Zina's. So Zina, as I said, was the daughter of a woman named Zina. Page 153 is where it starts. And then we'll turn to the thing I want to read. But we looked around for a little picture. This is a little picture we found. I don't know what she looked like. But anyway, she was a daughter of Brigham Young. And she was the first dean of women's students. That wasn't her title, but it was sort of in charge of women's students at the Brigham Young Academy. And the academy, after her father died, was really struggling financially. And John Taylor had come down here, and she thought, John Taylor, you haven't gotten the message yet. We're dying down here. We're being paid in cabbages and turnips, And so she had an opportunity to go up to see President Taylor at his house. And she asked for a private interview while she was there at the house. It was called the Garbo House, where he was living. she wanted to talk to him about the condition of Brigham Young Academy. So that's the Zina Taylor little thing. And then I found this several copies of several things, including a vision that her mother had where she spoke in tongues about the university, and I didn't know whether to include that or not. But I included this because it's one that I'd only heard about before but never read in her words. So this is in her words, and I just want to read the very end of it. When she was called into this room with John Taylor, then president of the church, and he said, it says, he took my hand in a fatherly way. I can just see him kind of taking her hand and patting her a little bit like this, a little patriarchal, fatherly way. Anyway, he took my hand in a fatherly way. This is in 156 at the bottom. And said, "My dear child, I have something important to tell you that I know will make you happy. I've been visited by your father," that's Brigham Young, who's passed away. "I've been visited by your father. He came to me in the silence of the night, clothed in brightness, with a face beaming with love and confidence, and told me many things of great importance, and among others that the school being taught by Brother Mazer was accepted in the heavens and was part of the great plan of life and salvation." Now just let me stop there. When I first was exposed to this, I thought, I wonder if are we still accepted in the heavens? Are we still part of the great plan of salvation for people that are coming here? Are they getting the education that leaves them also more better disciples of Jesus Christ, disciples in the disciplines? Anyway, part of the great plan of life and salvation, that church schools should be fostered for the good of Zion's children, and that we rejoice to see the awakening among the teachers and children of our people, for they would need the support of this knowledge and testimony of the gospel, and that there was a bright future in store for the preparing of the children of the covenant for future usefulness in the kingdom. And this is the line that really struck me, and that Christ himself was directing and had a care over this school. And that Christ himself was directing and had a care over this school. The prophet of the church said, your father came and said, Christ is aware of the school being taught by Brother Mazer. It has a contribution to make in the kingdom, and that Christ himself was directing and has a care over this school. Again, I wish everybody that is involved in the university somehow could take that in. What do you make of that? What do you think of that? What does it mean to you? Yes. Was there a hand over here first? Yes. I saw a hand back here and over there, both. Yes.
Oh, I was going to take that.
Please.
That dream.
Yeah.
And refer back to Carl G. Mazur's Last Address, which, thank you for including that. I'd never read it, and that actually really helped me in my own personal life.
Yeah.
About things. And he talks about a dream he had, where he had a dream of a building.
Yes.
With Brigham Young and a stranger, and he was walking through the building. It's an assembly hall, and he said, I woke up and I didn't know what the point of that was. 6 years later, the buildings burned down. They need a new building. 8 years after that, they were able to actually build that building that he saw in a dream. And so I think, to me, what I make of it from these multiple dreams over time, right? It's not just in one period of time, but over time, is that God still does direct.
Yes.
The affairs of the university, maybe not on a micro level, maybe at a micro level, but that he wants to guide us.
He still has a care over this school.
Whether it's temporal or spiritual.
That's right. I thank you for that comment. That's wonderful. And I'm glad you mentioned that other vision that President Mazer has. It was of the Mazer building, actually, before it was built. Yes, was there a hand back here, too? Oh, you were pointing to April. Thank you. Is it April?
Yes.
Thank you, April, for that marvelous comment. Anyone else want to say something? Yes, right in the back. Then I'll come back to you, okay?
Just curious if you could speak more to the volumes 2 and 3. Even this talk by a woman is mostly quoting a man.
Yeah.
More diverse
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to include more women, and let me know if there's some talks that you think that should be in there. Yes. Uh-huh.
Oh, I was just going to follow up on a similar note of, so I know that you mentioned, right, I mean, even if we look at our sort of leadership now, that we certainly see more women rising into positions of leadership, but even so, that's still like pretty recent and still mostly men. So I'm just curious, in the other volumes, do you have a sense of, or are you thinking about including, I don't know, like devotionals that have been given by women, or
Yeah.
talks that have been given by women leaders of the church, even if they weren't leaders of BYU, but maybe they're on the board of trustees, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any thoughts.
So most of the women that talk and most of the devotionals are about gospel themes. They're things you could get at any place, in conference as well as here. So, and I have kind of chosen to do what they did in this thing, which is to use women leaders. But let me just tell you a little bit about what we've got. So, in volume 2, I have, it begins with this talk by Dallin Oaks about a house of faith. But then I have a really wonderful devotional by Christine Hansen, which is on the aims of a BYU education. It's called Lift Up Thine Eyes to the Mountains. And she said each of those peaks in the aims is like a mountain peak. So it's a really lovely devotional. And then I've got a divisional a conference address by a woman named Susan W. Tanner called Learning by Heart. She didn't want me to put that in there, and she's fought me about this the whole time. I think it's Susan. I think it's really. It's not a conference. It was a. Wasn't it a graduation? Yeah, a graduation address. So a graduation address by Susan, and she said we kind of disparage memorization, but she said there are two words that we use for memorization. One, to dismiss it, we say that's just rote learning. But another one we can think about is, what do you know by heart? What do you know without having to consult? What's really deep in your heart? And she gave a really lovely little graduation address on that. Then I've got a devotional by Bonnie Brinton, which she gave at a conference I was speaking at too. It's called The Academic Anableps. Does anybody know what an anablep is? An anablep is a four-eyed frog. It sees both above and below the water. And she said, I'm an academic anablep. I see my discipline and I see the gospel. And she gets a really nice little, I think, a nice little metaphor for so that's that. And another thing I have in there is I wanted to include a talk that I think has been forgotten by Dallin H. Oaks. When he came to the university, he was asked a lot about the question about women, and so he gave a little talk called Women and Education. And he was raised by a mother who was a widow, and he said it's good for women to have an education not just about the humanities or other things. He said it's also fine to have a vocational education, because you're going to spend a lot of your life, whether you know it or not, you're going to spend a lot of your life outside where you need this kind of education. And so I wanted to include that talk. It's in a little section called 10 Perspectives on Learning in the Light, and I have a little talk have something by Martha Peacock, Cheryl Brown, Elaine Marshall, also in that section. And I guess it's in volume 3. I have the talk that I like called Gratitude in the Gospel, which was given by Marilyn Arnold in a graduation. And there we go. I can't see.
Time's up.
It's about learning in the light. I actually like, there's one of my very favorite psalms said, by thy light we see light. And I've encouraged, I'd love to see that somehow built into the university more. By thy light we see light. I learned later that actually is Columbia University's. And so they're a long ways away from that now. But I think that Psalm is 43, is it? Anyway, it's a wonderful little motto for our university. By thy light we see light. It reminds me of something C.S. Lewis said. He said, it's not just that he says I see everything by the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's how I see the world, it's not just some specific insight. Anyway, so I was going to tell you a little bit about books 2 and 3. I've told you a little bit now, but book 2, I had an accident a little while ago on a bike, and I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do these. So even though I'm a little wobbly still, I have written the last 2 books. This one's at the editor. Book 2 is at the editor, and it has the sections I was just telling you about. It has the House of Learning and a House of Faith. That's the one that Christine, and Susan and Bonnie are in, and then it has a section on a unique light. We've heard a lot about that. President Bednar came down here and talked about that. That phrase is from President Kimball's address, and the challenge to be. It's really a difficult challenge. How do you be both unique and excellent in the disciplines? And that's the challenge we live with. And so I have that talk. I thought I'd include Clark Gilbert's talk that he gave to other religious universities as well, called Dare to be Different. But Shane Reese's talk on hiring, I think, is on the uniqueness of BYU, is a good one. And then Elder Bednar, and there's some other ones. Kevin, a unique kind of education. Anyway, and then those 10 perspectives that includes that talk by Downen Oaks called Women in Education, which I think has been unfortunately forgotten. And it ends with the talk by Kevin Worthen called This is a Student. Do you remember that? He was paraphrasing the football coach. What's his name? The Green Bay Packers. Lombardi, yeah. This is a football. He holds it up, and gets back to the base. And Kevin said, "This is a student. This is what we're supposed to be about." Anyway, and that's the second. So that's the second volume. The third one, which I've got a draft of anyway. It's not an editor yet. Just so you know, it starts with the Zion University, which is the talk that Elder Holland gave. He was quite discouraged, actually. He's very discouraged as the president. He says, "This is really hard. Why does the university have? Why does the Lord expect us to have people that are educated and faithful? That's really hard." And he gives a really thoughtful talk about what it means to be a university in Zion. I think it's a marvelous talk. It's called the Zion University. But in this first section of the book, my argument here is that let's not talk just about who owns the university or where it's located, but what it means to be a Zion people in a Zion University. So it's all about what we need to be, who we need to be. And so there are a lot of talks there. It also has a talk from Sister Holland, which I thought that's where the tradition began of having the president's spouse speak. So anyway, I put a wonderful talk that I think is a very little short talk by her, but a really great little talk. And that's where it begins and then ends with so that's called the Zion University. What else have I got there? Oh, pardon? It ends with gathering. Gathering for education. And one of the questions in that last section is, can we do this virtually? I was with university presidents at BYU Idaho and Kim Clark and others who were really pushing distance education and cheaper education. And I said, you've got to, if you do that, I think we can teach people to be mathematicians and accountants and whatever, to learn content, but can we education at the university in church education has always been not just about information, but about transformation. Our forum speaker, devotional speaker yesterday, Melissa, talked about that education needs to be transformational. And can you do that virtually? And they've tried, and they're trying, and so I have a little section there about a virtual university. And then it ends with Elder Christofferson's talk on the aims. That's the only place I say, and I don't know if I'll keep this in, that I actually wrote the aims, but President Holland wrote the mission statement, and when I was there as an associate academic vice president, they asked me to do the aims, and I thought, what do you mean? We have a wonderful mission statement. Why do we need anything else? And they pushed me and pushed me. They said, so what do we want our graduates to become at the university? And it was before we moved the paradigm from teaching to learning. And I don't know if I was here for this. There was so much resistance. What do you mean? What learning? They take tests. I take my tests, and I know what they know. And so, but as a university, there's a paradigm shift that went across the whole academy, not just our university, where it says, define what are your students. You want your students to learn, and so I think that's what the aims was trying to do anyway. And what really opened that up for me anyway was going to lunch with Bruce Hafen. We decided, let's think about what Brigham Young wanted for the university, and I went back and read Humility on Brigham Young, and that kind of, every section of the aims starts with a quote from Brigham Young, if you'll notice that, and that's really where that kind of opened when I was trying to do that. That's what helped me a lot. Anyway, Susan, I haven't done what you've wanted me to do. I haven't read enough from the book. Do you have anything else that we did Zina, and I loved Zina. That's my favorite.
Well, maybe you should go back to the intro about steering by the stars, because that's the
Okay.
part.
So in the two things I was going to say in the third volume, I'm a little hesitant because I put more of myself in this book than I want. But in the third volume, there's a preface where I have and an afterword. In the preface, I talk about the beehive in the portico. And the beehive in the portico are the Mazer building, which was meant to be the front door of campus. If you come up toward the Mazer building, this is what you see. You see Greek Doric columns topped by a pioneer beehive. And I think that's Tertullian said, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? But I think that's what the university is trying to say. We're trying to combine both the classical or secular learning with pioneer or faith. And then the last one is a star. And the last talk I gave at BYU was to a group of leaders, and it was around Christmas time, and I said, I think what we should do here is what I charge you to do is to steer by the stars. And like the wise men, we don't know anything about those wise men, by the way, in Matthew. We've got this creches will have wise men at the cradle. That's not the scriptures, but anyway. So steer by the stars. Be like wise men. And what are the stars? And here are the 5 points of my star. There were the D&C 88. There's prophetic guidance. There's love of discipline. Anyway, a few of those things. Anyway, so it's wrapped. I tried to wrap the third volume in a preface and afterword that talks about some of my views of a BYU education. I am gone on just a couple minutes over, so I'll let you go. But sorry not to. I can answer any questions you have after. Okay, it's good to be with you.